All right, looking at the camera, Phil.
Yep.
What I thought is, what's your name?
My name is Philip Edward Danneman.
And what are you doing in San Antonio, Phil?
Oh, well, I'm here hanging out with a really good friend of mine that I haven't seen in decades. But the reason why I'm able to do this is because I worked for a rock band that performed in San Antonio a couple nights ago. Then we went to Gulf Shores, and we have a few days off in Houston. So I got my ass on a rental car, and he was nice enough to offer me the hospitality of a spare room, and here I am.
Okay, tell me about where you grew up.
Oh, I grew up a little town in upstate New York, not far from the Pennsylvania border, called Spencer, New York. In the 60s, I was born in 63, so in the 60s and into the 70s, it was a farming community, lots of dairy farms. And then in the mid-80s, that all changed because they came through and bought most of the farmers out. They gave them money instead of making milk, so.
So talk about that growing up. What was that like? Tell me about your dad. What was it like growing up?
All right, well, two-part question. The first thing growing up is I realized at a young age I didn't want to be a dairy farmer because that's really hard work. So, you know, my old man always told me don't be a dumbass mechanic like me, so I went out and I became a dumbass roadie or tech or whatever term you want to use. Growing up in Spencer, good and bad. Good because in some ways it isolated me from the rest of the world because it was, you know, predominantly your white, middle class, lower middle class kind of, you know, bedroom community. Everybody would commute to Ithaca to work or other cities nearby. So that was maybe a good part. Bad part is for the same thing, the good part. You were like isolated from the actual real world. You just, you know, heard about it on TV at night from Walter Cronkite and all that, but I don't know.
Yeah, trying to get to the idea that trying to portray a context of that whole environment.
All right.
So you kind of lived on a farm.
Well, there's again two-parter. Started out living right in town in Spencer on Maple Avenue, and lived there from my earliest memories until I want to say it was 1973 when we went to the farm, which was I don't know, maybe a couple miles out of town, if that. So it wasn't like we got up and, you know, moved a long way, but move is a move. So living in town, I have good memories of it because, you know, I had the neighborhood kids and we'd all, you know, play. And again, it's a quiet town. So, you know, you'd like ride your bikes on the street. You didn't really have to worry about, you know, getting hit by cars or whatever. Although I did manage to get hit by a car. But there you go. Yeah. It was after we moved down to the valley, right? For some reason, my mom didn't think I should ride the school bus. So my mom would bring me to school in the morning, and then I would walk home, right? Because, you know, my parents were born in, my dad in the teens and my mom in the 20s. So they went through the Depression, and you got the whole speech of, I walked 5 miles to school and whatnot. I mean, it wasn't that long, but my mom definitely walked a couple miles to school. I've seen so, you know, it was like, get out of school and walk home. Okay, whatever. So I was doing something I should have. I was like playing soccer or kickball at that time with some kids, and the ball went out into the street, like the main street. What is that, 34 or 96 or whatever that goes to Candor?
Yeah, 34.
And I ran out from the ball, and you remember Old Man Cotton? Right?
Yeah, the name is...
Kind of, right? He had an old beat-up pig. Anyway, he's the guy who hit me, right? So, granted, it wasn't bad. Like, you know, I think I got a concussion from it, and then my foot got all bruised and blew up like a grapefruit, but knock wood, other than that, I was okay. You know, but there you go.
So, with your dad, what did he teach you? Tell me about like some of the lessons growing up. Talk about that a little bit. Like some of the things you did together, cutting wood, you know, just surviving and that sort of...
Well, I mean, I'll tell you the one thing my dad always told me. My dad never told me not to do something. He always told me, don't let me catch you doing it. Right? So like, I guess that left a little leeway. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't like the cutting wood part didn't start till we got down to the farm, right? So here's kind of a weird one. Okay, so this is the early 70s, and you know, everybody I know has indoor plumbing and you know, electricity and heat and all that, and that's what I grew up with. Well, when we moved to the farm, it had belonged to my mom's uncle who passed, and when we first got down there, the bathroom was outside. It was an outhouse. There was one cold water faucet in the kitchen, and you know, there was like electricity, but like, you know, what you would imagine, like you pull the cord, right? Like the light switch wasn't on the wall. So, I mean, granted, my folks redid the house and all that, and you know, made it what it is today, but you know, as a kid going, what's going on?
So did you have to use the outhouse?
Oh yeah, middle of the winter. I mean, this went on for a few months. I mean, that's my memories. But again, if my mom were still alive sitting here, she'd be like, oh, that's a bunch of crap. This is what really happened, you know, or whatever. But like, to get back to my dad was a hard ass, and I never met his dad because he passed before I was born, but it sounded like he was a hard ass, you know what I mean? It was that, but again, you know, it was that mentality, right? Like, I can remember when I was in Maple Ave and Spencer, like, you know, comparing ass whoopings. He'd be like, oh, that's nothing, man. My dad beat the crap out of me. I mean, it's horrible to say, right? But in that time period, that's what it was. That's what happened, right? So, I mean, there was, you know, like, you know, it's like, okay, well, if I screw up, you know, my old man used to cuff me in the back of the head, right? You'd never see it coming, right? I rarely ever got like spanked by him. I always got like hit in the back of the head, which really annoyed the crap out of me because it's just like, and you just never see it coming, right? And sometimes be like, well, what did I do that for? What is that, like a preemptive strike? You know, like to remind me not to do dumb shit, right? Whatever. But I mean, he was a good guy in that he taught me, you know, like you got to go out and you got to work hard. I mean, he taught me work ethic at the time. I didn't realize it, right? But when we got down to go back to getting down to the farm in the valley, there was no central heat. There was a stove in the kitchen, and half of it was like a 2-burner gas stove, and the other half was wood stove. And that's how we heated the house for the first, well, I mean, we always heated it by wood when I lived there, right? But when we first got there, before we actually got a proper like wood stove and put in a proper, like, you know, my mom liked to cook on electric, right? So we got an electric, you know, range or whatever they called it. So it was like on Sundays, you know, you went up and you cut wood. Whether you liked it or not, as a kid, I hated it. You know, I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm still not a big fan of cutting wood. I try to avoid it. Haven't done it.
Do you own a chainsaw?
I do. I still do it at home. My wife would probably like to see me do it a lot more since like the driveway, all the brush is encroaching, but whatever. But yeah, on Sundays you went and cut wood. We had this little small International Scout. I wanna say it was like a 61 Scout. So it only had like a 4-foot box, right? So you could only basically get enough wood cut for a week. So you're doing it every week. And then when you would like get into the warmer seasons where you'd cut wood and stack it to season, so in the fall, you know, and like, you know, my dad didn't have to buy a wood splitter because he had me. You know, it wasn't until like after I left that like, you know, the wood splitter and the riding lawnmower came in, because once I left home, he lost all those things. So. I'm getting off topic, I know, but.
You're doing exactly what I want you to do.
Got you.
The exact same, yeah, great. So, I don't want to skip over too much, but, so what brought you into, maybe let's talk about that. So let's talk about going to Ithaca and then going to Syracuse and ultimately getting, like, how'd you fall into this business?
All right. Well, I was, you know, as many of us were then, I grew up in the Methodist church from my earliest memories in Holsey Valley. My mom was a devout religious lady, a Christian. So I had memories of, you know, going to church. And as I've shared with you, like the sermons back then just scared the crap out of me. I like, lived in fear, which I guess is not really what you're supposed to do, but whatever. That's what I did. Like, there was nothing that I was going to do that, like, the way that the preacher, who is definitely a hellfire and brimstone guy, would be like, you know, there was nothing I was going to do that was going to save me from hell. That's how I felt. So as things progressed, I got through like 6th grade, and there was a Catholic, or not, pardon me, that's later. There was a Christian school down the road from us in Ithaca Center, New York, right? My mom decided that 7th and 8th grade, well, that's where you're going to go to school. I need to get you out of the public school system, you know, and oh, you can do all this stuff. And I mean, I didn't want to go, not just because it was a Christian school, but because I was leaving all my friends, right? So I got all my friends that are now going to the high school in Spencer Vedetton, and now I'm going to this place. So, and their version of Christianity and what I'd been brought up with were really not the same thing. But it was a big change for me, and not in a good way. So I didn't really enjoy 7th and 8th grade. And then as far as 9th through 12th, I went to an all-male Catholic high school in Syracuse called Christian Brothers Academy. And part of that was because I was a competitive swimmer, and I was reasonably good up until like age 12. And then I, you know, discovered music and, you know, weed and girls, and went, swimming's kind of getting in the way of all that. So my priorities changed, if you will. But I continued to do it because it was something that, like, my old man was, you know, kind of pushing me to do. And I think he thought, well, maybe through swimming he'll have a better life than I did. I mean, you know, it is what it is. It's, I guess, what you do as a parent. I know I've had those feelings. So I kind of got half recruited to go up to Christian Brothers. And I really think that my parents thought, well, this is a really good accredited school, and this will help him. But, you know, I didn't really want to go, I'll be honest with you. But I went anyway. And then once I got to Syracuse, being from like a little podunk town, and this is like a big city, and realized like, wow, this bus pass that they give me, I can ride the city bus and go anywhere as long as it runs. It was kind of like giving, you know, a kid the keys to the candy store. So then, you know, I kind of like ran wild for 4 years up there, and, you know, I was fortunate enough to live with different families that took me in, that, you know, some of them it worked out, some of them it didn't, you know, because I mean, as I look back, I was a handful. Like, I wasn't an easy kid to deal with. But, you know, that's what happens. And the one thing that it did teach me how to do is it taught me how to hustle, which has served me and continues to serve me in my life to this day. So.
In what way?
Well, just like figuring out, like, for instance, you know, okay, I don't have an income. I need to get an income. Well, what can I do, right? I mean, now, like, I realized very early on with eBay, this is back when I think I've been a member since, or started on it in '98, in its infancy, right? Like, wow, I could take this stuff that, like, I find and sell it and make more money and have an income. Or, you know, I can, once Craigslist came along, right? Because I've, you know, been in the music business and whatnot, like, you know, I could buy a drum kit that maybe needs some heads for a couple $100 and do that, or fix it up and then sell it for $5 or whatever. It's just that, like, looking at, like, you know, well, what are my options? What can I do? I mean, it's very much like what a lot of people do today. I think, you know, with the whole e-commerce thing and all that, it's just a hustle. That's really all. I mean, that's really, in my opinion, that's what life is, right? And I'm, you know, somewhat good at it. I've managed to get to 59 years, so whatever. I don't know.
Well, that's interesting, because when I see you, I don't see a guy that would go, oh, that's beneath me. I can never do that. I see a guy that does it. You're a very proud person, but you're not so proud that you're like, oh, that's beneath me. I don't know what I'm saying.
Listen, how I look at it, and you've heard me say this, is like, I just look at myself as like an old whore, right? Pay me, I'm going to show up and do the job. Like, and, you know, especially over the past 30 years of having, thank God, being married to a wonderful, wonderful woman, and having the responsibility of, like, well, like, I don't want to screw up, because, like, you know, while I'm away doing my thing, she was running the household, getting all the bills paid, taking care of our son, raising our son, basically, because to make a living, you kind of had to be away at least 9 months a year, you know? I mean, it hasn't really changed. If anything, maybe it's got where you got to work more, you know, because inflation and everything's gone through the friggin' roof. So I was fortunate because as I like looked at it, it's like I had a full-blown partner, right? I mean, it was definitely like she's busting her ass at home and I'm doing the same thing, and it worked for us. Doesn't work for a lot of people, you know, and we've both had this conversation of like, you know, if we stayed home, maybe it wouldn't have worked, you know, but it worked for us, and that's what matters. But no, you know, I use the word blessed, but I've been blessed, you know, whoever that is, you know, I've been blessed because I have this wonderful person in my life and been in my life for over 30 years. That's just grateful.
Tell me about your love for music.
Well, can I tell the real version or the abridged version?
Tell any version.
Okay, I'm going to tell the real version because it involves you.
Yeah.
So this gentleman that you hear and you don't see, my friend Alan, who I've met in 4th grade, and to this day is one of my dearest friends, is one of those friendships where you don't talk for years, or in this case, I didn't see Alan for 30 years until sitting here, and it seems like we just picked right up where we were as teenagers. So, boring story, even longer. I go up to Alan's house, and Alan's like,
What year is it?
this would have been the summer of 76, right? Because I would have turned 13 in 76, yeah. But this was before that, because I think if we were just out of school for the summer, or maybe it was definitely like spring. It was warm. I remember it being warm.
I'm just trying to paint a...
Yeah, no, absolutely. So at any rate, Alan has an older brother who I always thought was only like 4 or 5, turns out like 6 years older than me. But at any rate, he had records and he had weed. And Alan's like, hey, you ever smoke some weed? No. You want to smoke some weed? Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I smoked weed for the first time, and I listened to 2 records that to this day I can still tell you. I listened to side A of Rush 2112 and side A of Rainbow Rising, and it changed my life. I was like, I don't know what this stuff is, but this is the best thing I've ever heard, and I want to be a part of it. And I realized even by then, like I had tried to like kind of learn how to play drums because my uncle was a drummer, and like I just didn't have the patience for it. But like somehow I am going to work with music or in the business or whatever, and that's really where it started. And I just developed this incredible love for music. I mean, like I lived for it. You know, it was like you'd be like staying up late and like at midnight, you know, whatever radio station I could get down in the valley, sometimes ICB out of Ithaca or VBR would, you know, okay, so-and-so's record's getting released at midnight, and they'd play the record, right? So I'd be up there with my like little, you know, stereo, and of course my parents' bedroom's right next door, so it's like just almost unintelligible, but like it was a big deal, right? And I just lived for it, like, you know, trying to get to whatever concert I could see, and I just was like, somehow I'm gonna be a part of it, right? And again, you haven't heard me say it yet, but maybe you have. I always say that if I have a memoir, it'll be called More Luck Than Judgment. And I stole this term from a gentleman I worked with back in '96 on Garbage, our lighting director, Carl. And it came from, we were in Tokyo, and we were navigating the Tokyo trains and subways, and we actually got where we were going, and Carl's like, well, that was more luck than judgment. And I'm like, oh, that's genius. So whatever, I'm giving him props. Carl, I'm giving you props. So at any rate, in New York, the drinking age was 18 then. So about 16 or whatever, because like I had facial hair, I started going to clubs. I mean, you gotta understand, there's no picture IDs. Like you just, like I guess you could get a sheriff's ID, but a New York driver's license back then had no photo on it. So like I got my permit, and then like got my license, got my night license at 17, you know, and was able to like, whenever I could get the parents to let me use the car, I'd go into Ithaca, and I go to this bar that's long gone called the Derby, because that's where my friend Toby, any of his bands would play. Like back then, I think they were called Emerald Wood, or there was Skin Tight, whatever, you know, and I would go to see him play guitar. And then one time, like the gear showed up late, and it was like, hey, can you give us a hand bringing the gear in, right? you know, and when I say gear, it was like in like a small, you know, 16-foot truck or whatever. Not a lot by today's standards. So I bring the gear in, and he's like, well, you know, there's some draft in the dressing room. Help yourself. I'm like, free beer? Oh, hell yeah. You know, so that's kind of, and it wasn't like this happened all the time, right? This may have happened like 2 or 3 times. And then moving forward, I go to Plattsburgh State University for a year. I'm on the concert committee there, which just basically means you're free labor for the bands that come in and play. You move the gear in and out for free. You get to see the show. That's how the whole college concert committee thing worked. And then I get kicked out of Plattsburgh because it turns out your grade point average is not like a golf score. The lowest score wins. So they're like, yeah, you really have to go to class. Oh, okay, got it. So I come home and I go to a local community college, Tompkins Cortland Community College, and I reconnect with my friend Toby. And he was then going into this local band out of Cortland, New York called Centaur, and they actually had equipment and gear and all this stuff. And like, I kind of like, I don't know if I'd say I pushed my way in or was like, but I came in with him. So that's kind of where it started, and it's just been going. I mean, you know, I can't remember if it was the end of '82 or the beginning of '83, but it's been 40 years. So, I mean, there's a lot more to the story if you want to hear it, but that's kind of the abridged version.
Well, I want to go back and talk about that Still Damn and listening, what music meant to you as that country kid that lived literally miles from nowhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you were living miles, from town.
Yeah.
And any big city was at least, how far is it?
Well, Ithaca from my house, I want to say it was like 20 miles to downtown. From Holsey Valley. It was a little closer from like in town.
Yeah.
But I think it was like, if I remember right, it was a solid 20 miles.
Well, between Halsey Valley and Ithaca are a bunch of farms.
Oh, yeah.
And so what did music mean for you? What did it do? Why did you want to listen to it?
I don't know, Alan. I mean, like from that day forward, it consumed me. Like it was like, you know, and I've done a lot of them, but it was like the best drug that I found, right? I mean, it was like, it was cool to smoke weed and listen to music, but I didn't need to smoke weed to listen to music. But not having music, that was a problem, right? Like, I mean, if my parents would have been like, no, you get no record player, you get no record, no music, it'd have been a serious problem for me. It was just like this, I just fell in love with that type of kind of like, at the time it was called hard rock. I guess there was heavy metal then, I don't know, but it was like this hard rock thing, right? And then discovering other bands. Like I remember my poor mom, I think I probably ruined her, but there's a little store in Spencer, the supermarket, it's called the Spencer Big M. And believe it or not, back in those days, they actually sold records there, vinyl. They had this little display, couple wide, not much. So I go in there with my mom, and here's this band, Black Sabbath, right? And the record is called Sabotage, right? It's like these 4 guys and dressed up in what, you know, even now I guess you'd call like weird clothes, right? And like standing in a mirror, but like halfway through a mirror, whatever. I was fascinated. And I'm like, Black Sabbath, well that's gotta be good. And convincing my poor mom to buy this record for me, right? So then I start there. I've already heard Rush, I heard Rainbow, and you know, just scraping pennies together to like buy records or listen to it on, you know, then it's like she bought me a little cassette recorder. Now you gotta understand, in those days it was like there was a little speaker and your cassette tape here and a microphone, and it was mono, it wasn't like a recorded in stereo. And like I would literally hold the microphone up to the speaker and record, like, you know, whatever song it was that came on, right? Like, oh, I like this, I'm gonna, you know, this was before I had like the stereo and you could actually put a cassette in and record somebody else's records, or, you know, that technology hadn't arrived for me yet, right? This is what I would do. And, you know, little by little, and then like going to, you know, it kind of got stifled going to the Christian school, right? Because I can remember that they used to have the speakers, right? But like you could listen, right? Because basically, as you know, like a speaker is also a microphone, right? You just switch the polarity on it and whatever. So they would make them as microphones to listen to the kids, right? And I can remember getting pulled into the office because I was singing Iron Man, right? I'm like cruising down the hall like, Satan laughing spreads his wings, oh Lord, yeah. next thing you know, like, get in here right now. What is that? You can't sing that in a Christian school. And I'm oblivious. I'm like, really? I don't know. It's just like, it's a cool song to me. But I remember that happening, right? And then once I got to Syracuse, well, then that was like, that opened things up, right? Like I saw my first real concert. I was fortunate enough to see Rush in, I think it was November of '77 at the War Memorial in Syracuse. And there was this band that opened up for him called AC/DC. Never heard him, and I became an immediate fan, right? And I hate to say it, but I think I went out like the next day or two later, and I asset relocated an AC/DC record from JCPenney. I'm sorry, JCPenney, but if I'm being honest, that's what happened, because I didn't have the money to buy it, right?
This is the Bond AC/DC.
Yeah, Bon Scott. Like I just remember, I have that visual, right, of that show of not only Rush, but like AC/DC and like Bon, like having Angus on his shoulders and like going around through the crowd, right, with him and all that. And like that was the first time I saw headbanging, right? That was the first, to me, that's the guy who invented headbanging. Now, I'm sure I'll get argued with or whatever, but that's the first time I ever saw it. Like, wow, this guy never stops. He just walks around playing guitar and he's doing this the whole time. Like, how can you do that, And I just remember being like floored by the band, right? Just like, wow. And I remember he was playing the SG, right? But it had all this silver duct tape on it. Obviously it, had been broken or whatever. I didn't know, but I was just fascinated, right? So this is great. And then Rush comes on. Oh my God. It's like, they were my heroes. Like if you, worship a band, well, that was me. That was it. So seeing those guys was just incredible. And to add to it, because we'll probably get into it later, but I always loved it with Rush because on the records, they always listed their crew guys, right? And their crew guys like always had a nickname, right? It was like, Skip the Slider, Gildersleeve, and, Lurch was the stage manager, and, I can't remember them all now, but I just was like, I want to be one of those guys, honest to God. Like that was way back when I was like, I want to be one of those guys. I want to have my name on a record and, whatever. And so that was what I was like trying to get to. Took a weird road, if you will, or whatever, but like, it wasn't like I set out. I just was like, again, more luck than judgment. I connected with an old friend who played guitar, who was going into this band Centaur, and I was able to like learn my craft and able to make mistakes at a level in the clubs where it's not like you're making mistakes on a huge stage or whatever, with thousands of people. It was like a couple hundred people like, oh yeah, the guitar's out of tune. Yeah, I screwed that up. Sorry. It's still, to me, I feel the same way about it. It doesn't matter where you are. It's like, okay, I failed, whatever, but I got to learn, right? And hone my craft. And then, again, just more luck than judgment. Like the sound guy was really good, Paul. And at the time, Gary, the bass player in the Rods, was playing for Kim Simmons, who was, the lead and originator of Savoy Brown. But at the time, it wasn't called Savoy Brown. It was called the Kim Simmons Band because, of course, it was the mid-'80s. And really, nobody gave a shit about the blues, English blues then. It was all like, starting to be like, hard rock bands and heavy metal, if you will. So it was like he was, playing different stuff. And so Paul was like going to go mix them. And I really just kind of tagged along, right? Like, okay, yeah, come out and, run lights or whatever. And then like the road manager quit. So I became the road manager. And then the guy who was the road manager was also Kim's guitar tech. So then, well, you're not running lights anymore. Now you're a guitar tech. Guitar tech? What the hell is that? I don't know how to be a guitar tech. Like I can set a drum kit up and I can take like cabinets out and put them up. But like guitar tech, I'm not good at that. Right? Like I tried to like put strings on my friend Toby's guitar and I'd always screw up the tuning and all this. I'm like, I'm not good at this. And I proved that to Kim, right? Cause like, he'd be like, look, just set my gear up. I'll tune my guitars, God rest his soul. He's just left us. But, I think back of it now and I'm like, man, you should have fired my ass right away. Cause I wasn't, in my mind, I thought I was great, but I look back at it now and it's like, oh, it's horrible. So again, fortunate, more luck than judgment, stayed with them for a while. And then, at this time, my local bar was a place in Ithaca called Captain Joe's Reef. And at this time, bands that were with Megaforce Records or associated with Jonny Z down in Jersey, this was like, they would come up to Ithaca, New York and record. Like I could be wrong, but I think Metallica's first record was recorded there, Anthrax recorded there, Overkill, Raven. So I'm in my local drinking, and I just happened to get drunk with the drummer in Raven, Rob, you know, and I guess talked myself into a gig because I went back to my parents' house to like check messages, and my mom's like, this guy, Johnny somebody, Z Johnny. I'm like, Jonny Z? Yeah, he's calling. Like, you got to call him. You've been calling, like, so I call him and he's like, oh, finally, you got back to me, right? Or maybe I talked to Tony, who at that time was also a co-manager of the band. But the story is like, they're like, okay, so like, you know, you're Rob's new drum tech. Like, we're starting rehearsals in like 2 days on Long Island. You got to get down here on a bus. And I'm like, what? Blacked out. I didn't know. God's honest truth. I didn't know. I had talked my way into a gig. So I'm like, okay, you know, and I remember like, they told me what I was making, and then they told me that I was getting per diem. I didn't know what per diem is, right? It was like, I think $20 a day. And I literally went like, okay, so let me get this straight. So you're gonna pay me my wage, and you're gonna give me another $20 a day? Like, that's $140 a week. Yeah, was that a problem? Oh, hell no, it's no problem. I just want to make sure. I had no clue, right? And so I ended up getting on a bus and going down there and faking it. Right? Like, I mean, I could set a drum kit up, but I could barely play like a 4/4 to like line check. Oh yeah, and that guy's a lefty. So now I got to try to play open hand. Oh, it was a shit show, right? Like, and again, I'm so grateful that like he didn't just go, oh, you got to go, you know? Again, so grateful because of course I wanted to do it, so I learned, right? I like, okay, I got to learn I got to get my shit together. But I mean, sorry, Rob, but true story, that's really how it went down.
Let me give you this, see if this helps.
And that's, oh, okay, thank you.
See if that might make it worse.
And that's how, I don't even know which way do you put it, this way, that way?
It goes that way, but you can do it any way you want.
Gotcha, all right.